Hi everyone, my name is Francesca Perrone and I will be giving a brief presentation on water contamination in Hinkley, California. Hinkley is a town found in the San Bernardino County in California. It is part of a gas pipeline system that links Texas to California. Our environmental story originates in 1952 when Pacific Gas and Electric Company, or PG&E, installed a compressor station. The company utilized a carcinogenic chemical known as hexavalent chromium, which I will describe more throughout the presentation. This compound was utilized as a corrosion inhibitor in the cooling systems. The water produced was then discharged into unlined ponds until 1972. The discharge contaminated the soil and underground water in the town, which then found its way into the water source that people drank. Intervention did not occur until the 1990s, despite knowledge of this fact, when legal clerk Aaron Brockovich began to investigate the deteriorating health of clients that lived near the plume site. The objective of this presentation is to unpack Hinkley's story and highlight any key lessons that we can learn and implement in the future to avoid similar public health mishaps. The most important aspect is that people must be aware that water sources are not always pure and that they may be exposed to toxins. Given this knowledge, scholars, government agencies, and environmentalists should study potential chemicals and identify the safety of exposure and find ways to address how to remediate high exposures. We can also study how occupational practices have a negative impact on community health, the environment, and socioeconomic status. And moreover, this draws attention to the need for accurate and timely data, because accurate data allows us to install the best intervention that is appropriate for vulnerable communities. This is my brief table of contents. I have already given an overview of the water contamination in Hinkley and its source. I will then give a brief overview of chromium-6. We will understand some of the risks associated with this carcinogen, and further discuss the population at risk and current water toxicity in Hinkley. This is figure 1, and it is a spatial representation of the concentration of chromium-6 in Hinkley, California. In 2011, a remediation project began to convert chromium-6 into chromium-3. As we can see, in 2011, there was a high density of chromium-6. As the remediation process occurred, this density has decreased. However, it is not yet completely removed. So, our carcinogen of concern is chromium-6, or hexavalent chromium. It is a heavy metal that is utilized as an anti-corrosive agent to paint, primer, and surface coating. In our story, it was used as an additive to prevent rust in cooling towers. And while this substance should be filtered in special tanks that collect dangerous metals that can be reclaimed, it was not. It was filtered into unlined pools. And it was already known that chromium was hypothesized to cause damage to organs and different types of cancer. In this graph, we can see that in rats, the longer that they are exposed to carcinogens such as chromium-6, the lower their probability of survival. This is an interesting data point that can be related back to humans. Despite knowledge of water toxicity of chromium, in 2012, a site visit yielded that over 30% of water sources have over the recommended amount of chromium in their water source. This is of concern because it means that many residents of California are being exposed to harmful substances. Moreover, it should be noted that the state of California did not pass criteria for baseline and safety measures for chromium until the 1990s, which was beyond the point of knowledge that chromium-6 can have detrimental impact on health. In this graph, we see that the population of Hinkley has dwindled over time, but not necessarily for the reasons that we may believe. This story seems to suggest that the population of Hinkley will dwindle as disability and disease become more apparent in the community. However, in 1993, after the settlement between PG&E, many of the homes were bought by PG&E. Many residents moved out in order to avoid continued exposure to the carcinogen. Thus, the dwindling population in this town is not necessarily due to disability, but rather due to exposure and fear of people to be continued to be exposed to the toxin. In this slide, we can see the health outcomes that are associated with chromium-6. From 1996 to 2008, there were 179 observed cases of cancer in Hinkley. This data point is rather interesting because the same study in the control population found that there were 224 cases of cancer. Thus, this dismisses the association between chromium exposure and exacerbated health risks. But I believe that this is a flawed data point because many of the residents of Hinkley had left prior to the initiation of this study. Thus, this data cannot necessarily be used to paint the accurate picture, but I'm using it in my presentation to highlight the fact that we as public health scholars must create foolproof study designs that can truly study the association. Moreover, it was very difficult to track down many of the residents since they had moved. Thus, the study design was flawed to begin with, and it is very difficult to identify the true association between chromium exposure and health outcomes. In summary, we have learned that there are many chemicals in water that can impact health. We have seen that this causes a large impact on the environment as the environment becomes polluted, which then in turn has an impact on the health of individuals. The longer individuals reside in a community, the longer their exposure, which may increase their risk for adverse health outcomes. This exposure to adverse health outcomes, as we have seen in Hinkley, has created a ghost town, which can truly hurt the socioeconomic status of a community. There are very few residents left, and many industries are beginning to shut down as a result. Overall, I believe that this study suggests to us that there is a need for accurate data. As we saw in the previous slide, it is difficult to associate the health outcomes in association to chromium-6. It is almost as if these data points negate the association that exposure to chromium can have a negative impact on health. Thus, as public health scholars, we need to create robust and independent studies that can truly find the association. As public health scholars, we have all of the passion, desire, drive, and resources necessary to create adequate studies that can truly improve the public's health. We should not ignore vulnerable communities, and we should always be mindful of practices that can hurt the environment, health, and socioeconomic status of a community. Lastly, these are the references that I used throughout my presentation. Thank you for your time, and I appreciate your listening to my presentation.